Our next speaker is Dr. Craig Bingman. Many of you heard from Craig at the banquet dinner, so I'll keep this introduction relatively brief. But Craig has been absolutely instrumental in developing our understanding of the chemical processes that underlie essentially every aspect of our hobby. He's been an early pioneer, and he's also the 2019 MASNA Award winner. Please welcome Dr. Craig Bingman. Today, he's going to be speaking about, well, some stuff he wants to talk about. So give him a round of applause, please.
So, like many of you, I was out kind of pretty late last night at the bar, and I woke up this morning and I found that someone had pranked me and put this speaker thing on my name tag. So I guess I have to give a talk today, right? There was a title for this talk, and then it was just like, I'm just going to talk about some stuff because I won the MASNA Award, so it's like it's completely relaxed from here on out, right? I mean, I'm on glide path sort of for the rest of my life. So thank everyone involved with the conference and with the nomination and selection process for the MASNA Award. As you know, I did win a major award last night. It didn't actually look like that though. I thank Joe for this photograph from last night. And as you can see, I couldn't see. I was completely blinded. It was really bright up there. Sort of unnecessary roughness there with the lights. But there's some awards that I'm probably even more proud of than that. So you may know that I have a nearly 3-year-old son, and it's been very interesting for me to have Kai. And this vacation, there's always like a new revelation every day. So the revelation of this vacation was that I'm now the dad who has to win prizes at carnival things so my kid can get like a stuffed toy, right? So I'm not sure if this is going to play or not, but it turns out that I did it, right? So yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. The MASNA Award was nice, but this is really the prize right here. So I was thinking about what I was going to talk about, and there's a lot of things that I could talk about. I thought about doing like a timeline thing, right? So I was gonna start out with a Big Bang, and the talk might go on like 1 million years or something. That didn't seem very good. But there were some like really significant events in the history of the Earth that I might have highlighted. One of which was the oxygenation of the planet in the primordial ocean. There's about as much iron dissolved in it as there is sodium in seawater today. So if you're wondering why life requires iron, it's because there was a lot of iron around in the beginning of when biochemistry was established. Not so much now because of oxygen, right? And there are these huge banded formations of iron in various places of the world. They're commercially valuable iron ore deposits as well. So that was a big deal, but I decided I wasn't going to talk about that. I could have talked about stromatolites and the billion-year-old association between calcification and photosynthesis. And this is actually in the Bahamas, and these guys are probably just getting absolutely slagged right now. So, but they have been around 1 billion years, and I'm thinking they're probably going to make it, right? These are limestone formations that are formed by cyanobacteria on the surface, and they sort of disproportionate bicarbonate, and they like make some calcium carbonate. They generate some CO2. And this is the same trick basically that corals play today. But I decided I wasn't going to talk about that either. So one thing that I do want to talk about is my personal arc through the hobby, and this talk will basically cover, the aquarium hobby according to, as told by Craig Bingman. And in the beginning of my like really serious dive into the hobby, There were Martin Moe's books, and they, as I mentioned last night, they were extraordinarily important to me, and I can't thank Martin enough for, I just cannot imagine actually the aquarium hobby without Martin having the foundational role that he played in our hobby. So in the 1990s, don't read this. I'm just sort of going to gloss over this. So the internet was starting, and there were these things called Usenet news groups. And I was a graduate student, and I was finishing up, and I started reading, and I noticed that there were some groups about aquariums out there. I was like, whoa, this is pretty cool. And in fact, there was some people talking about reef aquariums. Imagine this, they were having a hard time maintaining calcium and alkalinity. And even then, the threads were like quite heated about this. In fact, the one that I responded to first was called Calcium and Alkalinity Wars, okay? So, but I was very timid, and I actually got someone named Patty Beatles, who I'm still friends with. I think she's completely out of the hobby right now. But I sent this to Patty, and I said, could you read this and see if it's worth posting? Because I'm really not sure. I'm just a graduate student, and I don't really have a marine tank set up right now. And she decided that it was worth posting and put it up on the Usenet news groups in 1992. The first post that I think I was involved with was 1991, and I was trying to prevent someone from making a bomb or something like that with potassium permanganate and oxidizers in a glass bottle. So I made my first sort of post in 1992, and I got flamed, actually. Some guy named Greg Smith said, how cute, let's throw some equations in to give credence to our thoughts. Why not, Do you know that they are the dominant equations governing what happens when you add substance X to your tank? In some cases, at least, adding calcium hydroxide also decreases alkalinity. So I thought calcium hydroxide seemed like a pretty good way to go even then. And there's a lot more going on than you think. So Greg Smith, who flamed me in 1992, standing here before you today, I have only 2 words for you, okay? And the first one doesn't begin with F. I won, okay? I won. So I spent a lot of time early on thinking about calcium and alkalinity supplements, and to distill down a whole bunch of stuff to the point of being almost unrecognizable. Calcium and alkalinity supplementation today is as easy as 1, 2, 3, right? So there are some 1-part supplements like calcium hydroxide and calcium carbonate CO2 reactors, where there's one stream of stuff going into the aquarium. There are 3-part system that was originated in 1994, I think, by Hans Balling in Europe. And there's the 2-part stuff, which is really a uniquely North American contribution to the hobby. And Bob Stark is with us today, and he was involved with the first commercialized 2-part supplement, ESV B-ionic. And people still use it today to great advantage. There were some other early ones that came along, like Sea Balance and some others. So the process of, so also sort of during this time, I was trying to make things easier for people, and I made a toss-off suggestion. I can't remember if it was on CompuServe or where. So I was downloaded all the CompuServe archives, and I was going through all that old information, and it turns out that FishNet never got backed up, right? So there was an attempt to download all the content off of CompuServe before they turned off the lights. And the backup, as it turns out, was incomplete. So I guess I can say anything I want to about the stuff on FishNet now, because I asked everyone, did you have a backup of FishNet? Do you have and nobody has it. To the extent that it exists, it's all on old computers that probably won't turn on anymore. So anyway, I did make this toss-off comment really early, that instead of like just throwing in, you know, a calcium supplement, which is maybe solid or something like that, and some buffer, which might be solid as well, and people just were like all over the place with their calcium and alkalinity numbers. Why don't you just make a 1/2 molar stock of calcium chloride and a 1 molar stock of sodium bicarbonate? And this idea, let's just say, was in the collective consciousness of the hobby at about this time, right? And it is through these discussions and these very early products that all of the liquid, ionic, rational, fractional, proportion products sprung. So this is where they started, and you know, I give Bob really a lot of credit for being first on the board with B Ionic. We were both in Brooklyn at the time, right? And we were buds. We went to the same Aquarium Society meetings and hung out with the same people. And these are some of those people, okay? So people, we didn't call ourselves this, but people did call us the New York City or Brooklyn Reef Mafia, and I don't know why. But these guys are Tony Vargas and Terry Siegel, Greg Scheimer, and Doug Robbins. And all four are really dear friends of mine. A sad thing about winning the award, like really a long time after I did the work, is that not all of my friends can be here. Both Greg and Doug passed away some time ago. So I'm really sad that they can't, that they are no longer part of my life and that they can't be here today. I would have really enjoyed that. So, so I talked about some stuff that was going on in the early 90s. And then there was what I think was really sort of like the singularity in the reef aquarium hobby. And the focal point through which a lot of people got involved and could get involved with the reef hobby was the Reef Aquarium Volume 1. So Julian and Charles did a really excellent job with this. And I think that they made reef keeping accessible. And then there was like this accelerated period throughout the 90s where I would argue that we basically developed a toolkit for success that everyone is using today. It's baked into the design of all the the plug and play sort of aquarium systems that you get. It's in all the chemical supplements, right? So, you know, you are, whether you know it or not, when you grab all this stuff off, basically it was worked out somewhere in the mid-1990s. Rich has a secret home lab, and I want you to know that there was a secret home lab in my apartment in New York City. I painted a door, blank door, with epoxy paint so that it would be a little bit more resistant to the chemicals that I was using. And I had it on, you know, 2 filing cabinets, and that was literally my bench where I did a lot of the work for the Aquarium Frontiers articles that I later published. And these are actually some, I also didn't own a camera back then, which is too bad. And I remember that I snapped these images, and they're really poor, with a webcam that was attached to my computer. Well, my bench was right behind it, so I could kind of like aim it and take these pictures. So my first articles were in 1995, and for the Aquarium Frontiers. And I had to make my life more difficult than it should have been, so I wrote not 1 but 2 articles. And the subjects were light transmission in aquariums as a function of activated carbon use, and an article where I suggested that many of the coral autofluorescent pigments were structurally and sequence related to GFP, which is a really nice image of GFP that David Goodsell has produced and put on the PDB website. So these are like really artful representations of protein molecules, and I appreciate his work every time I see it. So what was going on then that compelled me to write about activated carbon and UV transmission? So there was an observation that corals often did not do very well after someone put a big load of activated carbon on their system. And there were two sort of schools of thought that was going on. Either there was a chemical process involved, so the activated carbon was either removing or adding something to the water that made the corals do poorly, or perhaps the activated carbon was increasing the clarity of the water to the point that the corals had a hard time, received too much light and went into kind of like a light shock mode. What wasn't apparent was the magnitude of any sort of light effect that was occurring in the aquarium. In those days, we could actually tell that our water was a little bit yellow because we used sort of more of a daylight color spectrum. I don't know how people today with these super blue LEDs even know if their water's yellow or not, because it's just blue all the time, right? So you may be having some of these problems and not realize it. So I think it's probably worth going through this again today, just because people's ability to perceive what may be happening with the system is a little bit impaired at this point. So this is a graph that I made. I collected water samples as a function of time during this activated carbon treatment, and I used a dual beam spectrophotometer to measure light absorbance through the samples. And this was where the system started out. This is my little 20-gallon tank at the time. And the water was kind of yellow. What's really remarkable is that, in an aquarium, if it were a meter deep, there would be less than 10% transmission of 400 nanometer light over a path length of a meter. So that's like 90% of it's being absorbed before it goes that far. That's kind of like a fairly big effect. In the near UV, the decrease in transmission or the absorbance of the water was colossal. And in wavelengths that might be plausibly created and escaped from metal halide fixtures, there was a 100-fold or 1,000-fold attenuation of the light because of the organic compounds dissolved in the water. So this is what the situation looked like as a function of time as I added the carbon. And as you can see, these transmission isotherms are shifting down. More and more light is making it deeper and deeper into the aquarium as time goes on. This is at 4 days into the time course and at around 100 hours, so close to 4 days. The water got a lot more clear, and these are the transmittance ratios in the system. So it's like transmission at around 100 hours versus when I started. The ratio of those two numbers is indicated here. And you can see that, again, around the 400 nanometer range, there's changes in transmission of 10, maybe 30-fold. And in the UV, again, the absorbance, the increase in transmittance was absolutely colossal. It was really hard to do these sorts of measurements. It required a lab-grade spec. So what I wanted to do was make a correlation with something that people probably could measure, which was APHA color units. And there were colorimetric tests for those. There was a Lamont test and a Hawk test for measuring APHA color. But now there's a fair number of people who have like Hawk colorimeters, like DR 890s or 900s. And this is one of the programs that's on your colorimeter. And you don't have to use any reagents to do it. You're just measuring transmittance through your water sample versus a pure water blank. So this was published in Aquarium Frontiers. There's a correlation. I correlated the number of APHA color units that I observed versus what the spectrum looked like. So you can kind of see where you're at on these graphs if you can go back and run down that article, if anyone wants this graph, I can send it to you. It's published. So that's an interesting thing that people can do now. And I also saw on the trade show that there are spectrometers actually that people can put in their aquariums now, and they could actually perceive a change in the different parts of the spectrum as they're doing something like an activated carbon treatment on their aquarium. So these are measurements that were really hard to do when I wrote these articles, but have actually now percolated up to the point where people can also follow along with things that you can just buy off the shelf in the hobby. So that's pretty cool. In my history, I've always tried to make chemistry more accessible to people and have taken some pains to try to explain what's going on. This is a slide from a talk that I gave showing the difference between colorimetric assays and titration assays. So I hope I was somewhat successful in that endeavor. One of the things that I'm probably most proud of was a kind of a quantitative model for calcification in aquariums. And this is a photograph of Marlon Atkinson. And Marlon got involved with the reef aquarium hobby for a while, again in the 90s. He was a professor at the University of Hawaii, and we were talking back and forth. And he was looking at some bigger systems. He was actually working on Biosphere 2. And I was looking at a bunch of aquariums that hobbyists had. And there was some literature on how fast coral reefs calcify out there. And there was a kind of this hypothesis emerged that coral reefs, our captive reefs, might calcify as rapidly as reefs in the wild. So how quick is that? It may surprise you that, or maybe not, that corals in your system or corals in the wild are capable of laying down between 10 and 20 kilograms of calcium carbonate per square meter per year. That's a lot of calcium carbonate. That's fast enough that the corals are going to can rip out in a completely packed top flight, top water motion, SPS, confluent aquarium, basically all of the carbonate alkalinity out of the water in the course of a single day. All right, so it's really fast, and this is why people have struggled with it so much. But again, with dosing pumps and all the cool supplements, calcium reactors, the technology to meet that really quick demand is satisfied today. So I wrote an article in Aquarium Frontiers and gathered some system data in 1998 from a bunch of people who were my friends and willing to share system details with me. And I made predictions with this quantitative model for calcification in aquariums and compared that with the actual observed rate in terms of how much calcium and alkalinity that they were adding to their systems. And the prediction is in blue and the observed rates are in red. And what you can see is that the prediction is basically within a factor of 2 of the observed values. So this is interesting because it gives you some system design criteria and guidelines to follow. So if you don't want to work too hard on calcium and alkalinity, don't load your tank completely up with coral, put some negative space in there, give the fish some room to swim. It still looks pretty, and you're going to have a lot easier time holding on to the system. And if you do that top light, top flow, sticks everywhere sort of system, you better brace yourself for impact, right? So this is how things looked in 1998 in the hobby. It looked like things were, our hypothesis was basically validated. And you know, this 1040 model is like averaged over all water temperatures and conditions in the wild, right? And these aquariums are all running at different temperatures and have different light flow in them. So the really ballpark numbers, but there's a good correspondence between wild calcification rates and rates that we observe in our system. A couple of years ago, I went back to this work and profiled the number of systems. I asked Rich for data, but he didn't give it to me, and neither did Joe, and I want everyone to remember that. Some people, though, were brave, and they did respond. Terrence of Neptune was a really exceptionally good sport about this. He sent me some great numbers, and the prediction in this case was about 4.5 kilograms per square meter per year, and what Terrence is getting is close to 9. So again, within this like factor of 2 tolerance, Terrence is running sort of on the high side of that. Sanjay, also a great sport, unlike Rich and Joe, sent me some data, and the prediction for Sanjay's tank was around 9 kilograms per square meter. The observed calcification rate was pretty close to that, around 11. Randy Donowitz, another great guy, truly great guy, who was really brave and sent me data. I don't know if they were afraid or what was going on. But anyway, Randy was super brave and sent me data. And in the case of Randy's system, the numbers match almost exactly, right? So a few more, MetroCat sent me some numbers. The modeled rate was a little bit higher than observed, but again, within 50% for her tank. Chris Roberts sent me some numbers. Again, a really excellent quantitative agreement between the prediction and the observed values. Predicted 5, observed 5.1 kilograms per square meter per year. Jason Langer had a system that was, again, within about a factor of 2 of prediction. So I thought that it would be around 5, and he's getting a little bit over 2. So I would suggest to you then, based on the numbers in 1998 and the work that I did a couple of years ago, that in the 1990s, we had, at least some individuals, had attained the ability to make corals grow at a rate that was just limited by the intrinsic biology of the animals, right? So we were doing as well as we could possibly do at growing corals at this very early time in the hobby. I think that what's happened really in subsequent years is that the toolkit has become more widely disseminated. The tech hardware is a lot better and more accessible. It's easier to make a good choice as to how to make the technical equipment to put into your aquarium today than it was then. I didn't just care about calcium and alkalinity though, and this is going to be a little bit small, but people have asked me. I've been talking about this for a while, and this is the original correspondence that I had with Randy Reed and I'll tell you what this is. But I wanted to prove that this actually happened because some people at Reed Mariculture wanted to see it. So here it is, guys. In 1997, I believe there was an article that came out that suggested that Dendronepthia was obtaining a fair amount of its nutrition from microalgae. And we were very interested in maintaining non-photosynthetic organisms at that time. If we were going to feed them with phytoplankton, the choice was to raise it. I was in New York City. The footprint, having a marine tank in your apartment, your tiny apartment, was a fairly major commitment in space. And it seemed unlikely to me that people were then going to devote, there are no basements, right? I mean, your stuff is all out in your living space in New York City. That they would also make a microalgae rearing rack seemed unlikely to me. So I started going through aquaculture. I'm like, somebody's figured this stuff out. So don't reinvent the wheel. At least look around and see what's out there. And I found Reed Mariculture in an aquaculture magazine. They had an ad there, and I approached Randy and I told him basically, I'm in the ornamental world. I think that people might be interested in adding phytoplankton to their tanks, and I'd read about your pace, so maybe we can work out something to get some samples. So he did, And I believe he also told me that this was really the first contact that the ornamental hobby had with him. This is a very well-established company. They were producing really colossal amounts of microalgae for aquaculture, but those two areas, the ornamental world and reed mariculture, had not touched yet. So jump forward to now. This is how this looks now. So I don't want to suggest that I'm taking any credit for the endeavor, the hard work, the intellectual investment that these guys have made, because I'm not, right? But I was a matchmaker, and there's no doubt about that. So I'm very, very proud to have brought reed mariculture into contact with the hobby, and I think that that's worked out exceptionally well, right? So now I guess I know why people try to hook people up to you, because it's sort of rewarding to look if it works out, right? I guess if it doesn't work out, then you just throw out that data or something. But anyway, it's fun. So I was always a big proponent of lime water, and I spent a fair amount of time trying to explain to people what they could expect from it in terms of how much evaporation they needed to hit different calcification rates, in an article in August 1998. And then I tried to do something to make that envelope bigger, and wrote an article called Expanding the Limits of Lime Water, where I suggested adding organic carbon vinegar to saturated calcium hydroxide to make a mixture that was about 50% stronger and contained enough carbon to match the need for carbonate alkalinity once the acetate was. So it was like in a very simple package. It was similar to a calcium reactor, because you got your carbon dioxide and your carbon, your calcium and your alkalinity all in the same package. And some people actually still use this today. I don't know if Joe still uses it or not. A while ago he did, but he's talking to Greg Bingman now, so I don't really know what's going on with Joe's tank too much. If you're using lime water, this is a trick that you may want to play. Some people have seen that at the higher acetate levels, it's feeding not only bacterial growth, but it's well established in the scientific literature that corals can absorb acetate directly from the water, so it's also feeding the corals directly as well. But you can get some cyanoblooms and maybe some sand clumping as well at high acetate. And here comes Kai. I wrote an article about making your own pH buffer standard solutions. And again, I think this one's sort of lost in the sands of time. But if you've got 20 mule team borax in your laundry room, you have a high pH standard. And the nice thing about this is that you only have to be really approximately horseshoes close with the amount that you put in there, because the pH is really insensitive to the borax concentration. Borax is an interesting substance in that it has both a mixture of acid and conjugate base in it in equal molar proportions. So you don't have to mix two things together to make a buffer. It has this intrinsic, very well-defined pH just built into basically the crystal structure of borax. And the pH of the standard solution that you get is pH 9.18. So it's I think it's a half a teaspoon per pint if you want to use English measurements, gets you really close to the NIST standard borate solution. And this is actually a primary pH standard, guys. So this is really a really very good high pH standard that you can make. And if I don't know if people know this or not, but the different pH buffer solutions, if you get them in bottles, the high pH one is the one that goes off the fastest because it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's really super handy to be able to grab some RODI water, throw some borax in, and have a really good pH check. I wrote a fair number of articles about the halides, and this sort of element by element discussion of aquarium chemistry was picked up by Randy Holmes Farley quite successfully. But I did write 3 element-focused articles on fluoride, bromide, and iodide. There's an old observation that I really need to get back to, and that was I did some work with fluoride, and Randy and Doug were the people, I guess, who were like brave enough for me to actually add some fluoride to their systems. And it turns out that the half-life of fluoride in an aquarium is only like 3 or 4 days. So it goes away really, really super fast. I think there's something important happening here. I don't know that it's going to have a direct implication on coral calcification or anything like that. I think that it may have something to do with what happens to phosphate in our system. So at some point, I'd like to come back to that. Sort of winding down some of the work that I did in the past. I did a bunch of simulations of what happens when you use different calcium and alkalinity maintenance systems. And these were simulations that were done incorporating both water changes and using calcium chloride and sodium bicarbonate or sodium carbonate as it doesn't make any difference, the outcome, as the alkalinity source. So this is a 2 kilogram per square meter per year, like 10 to 20% stony coral cover aquarium. So not a lot of coral. And one thing that I note is that although things look really dire if you don't do any water changes, there's a large change in there's a large depletion in everything except for sodium and chloride ion. There's also a fair amount of salt buildup too, that you have to bail salt out of the system. If you're doing a 25% monthly water exchange, this is a perfectly acceptable way to maintain calcium and alkalinity. There's really very little ionic shift, but you have to do the water changes, right? So things look worse earlier for systems with more coral in them. And even worse once you're up to around 100% coral cover, and they look like really, really bad if you got like a really intense system. So things are really going to die if you don't do water changes, if you're just bailing out salt in an aquarium that's full of stony coral. So this is not really a viable way of maintaining calcium and alkalinity for a lot of the systems that people aspire to. And even with fairly intense water changes, more than a lot of people do, there's a substantial depletion in everything except for sodium and chloride in the water. So this is an undesirable situation. I want to make one sort of like comment here, and it's important when you're getting advice from people to understand what kind of system they have, what kind of system that you have, and make sure that it's likely to translate. Because, you know, the guy who sets up an aquarium with like 10% coral cover, and he's telling you how things are going, this is over a 5-year period, right? He's telling you it's been up for like 6 months, a year, and he's telling you everything's fine. I'm just using calcium chloride and sodium bicarbonate. It's cool. Everything's good. Everything's growing really great. But you're the guy who has like, you know, a tank full of really rapidly growing coral and a lot of light. Your mileage is varying a lot from that other person. So always keep that in mind. You know, there are things that are universal in our hobby, and there are things that absolutely are not. And this is one of the cases where things really will not translate across systems with a substantial difference in the biological content. I'm sorry, one last thing. This is not much of a magnesium mystery. People have seen for a long time in their tanks when they're using some ionic supplements that the calcium goes up and the magnesium goes down. And the reason for that is that instead of this being the equation that governs calcification in the aquarium, calcium and bicarbonate makes calcium carbonate and CO2, hydrated CO2. Instead, there's a mixed carbonate that's being formed in our aquariums that has both calcium and magnesium in it. And this is not the N for stony corals is about 1 mole%, so it's very small. But N for a number of coralline algae is 50 mole%. So they're actually making dolomite in our system. And it was only a few years ago that people really figured this out and showed that this paradox that existed in the literature was people found dolomite in reef carbonates. And dolomite was thought to only occur, after the carbonates were in the earth for a really long time and a lot of heat, pressure, diagenic conditions. But they found them in very, very recent carbonates. What was going on? Well, it's because coralline algae are doing this, and this is where the magnesium is going in most of our systems. It makes calcium and alkalinity relationships more complicated because there's a third partner here that's being drawn from the systems. So, I've shown graphs like this for a long time where the system sort of slides along one of these diagonal lines as you add a balanced calcium and alkalinity supplement to it to traverse from the top or up from the bottom. You either have to add calcium or buffer to the system to put yourself back on this balanced line. What happens when you incorporate the magnesium loss is something like this. This is a projection of really a three-dimensional system. And what you see is that you every day you're adding in a pulse, let's say, your balanced additive, and you're restoring all the alkalinity that was depleted from the system, and then the mixed carbonate is formed. You add something that's really balanced for just calcium and alkalinity. It doesn't include magnesium, and each day the calcium sort of creeps up. What I'm not showing you is that an equal amount of magnesium is also lost from the system as well. This rate can be pretty fast in systems that have a lot of coralline algae in it. For the simulation that I did, the calcium ion concentration was going up by about a mg per mil per day. And it doesn't take very many days before you start to notice that something's really going amiss with your aquarium. This is really, I think, what's going on, and it's fairly simple to correct. You just have to measure magnesium, which is the slowest moving of the three, calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium, and keep that topped off. So the very, very last part of my talk, I want to spend a few minutes talking about, not myself basically, but all of you guys. It was at one point, it was another revelation that I had in my life, that in my hobbies I was like stalking Charles Darwin. And what do I mean by that? Well, I was really into orchids. I loved reefs, and I got really interested in carnivorous plants. And if you look at the titles of the books that Charles Darwin wrote, he wrote a number of things, but he wrote on orchids, coral reefs, how they form, and a couple of books actually on carnivorous plants. He really loved sundews. So that was I was like, wow, how weird is that? So is there anyone in the audience that keeps carnivorous plants? Some, yeah, a few. I don't think a lot of people in the world keep carnivorous plants, so the fact that there are even a couple of people here, three, who keep them is sort of a statistical anomaly. How many of you guys keep orchids? More people keep orchids, and I think much more than the general population. Why did that trinary constellation of hobbies sort of gel for me? I might argue that RODI water is sort of a gateway drug to all of those hobbies. And once you've acquired an RODI unit for one of them, it's just very easy to slide into any of the others, right? Because carnivorous plants are really quite robust and beautiful and interesting, but they need very low hardness water for almost all types of them. But you've got that, right? So all you have to do is go out and buy a carnivorous plant. And you've got the light, you know about light, right? So you're off to the races. So you can have carnivorous plants. Is there anyone who keeps poison dart frogs here? Yeah, again, some people do that as well. So here's an orchid. Here's a Drosera. This is one of the carnivorous plants that Darwin was really entranced by, because it will move when the tentacles will like entwine around the prey animals. They're really gorgeous. So this is a Nepenthes on the end, those two, and this is another, I think it's Drosera bifida. It's the dichotomously branching sundew that gets pretty bad. How many of you guys keep cats or dogs? Yeah, a lot of us keep that. So this was something that I got off the internet. It's supposed to be a Category 3 hurricane. I guess today we need a couple more cats, right, for the Cat 5. How many people are really take a great deal of pleasure in doing mechanical projects? Yeah, a lot of us do that, right? So that's another kind of close association with the reef hobby. So one of these, this is Boomer, I think, with one of his fast cars. I stole this off of Facebook. And this is an Alice Chalmers WD road crop tractor. And my dad one day literally brought one of these tractors home in a box. And he was so proud of himself. He was like, and I remember him pulling up with this thing, and I saw what was in the boxes. It was a tractor in the boxes, right, that we were going to have to put together. But he was just so happy because we were going to be able to do this together. So I think that that's great, and I think that there is like all this crossover between hobbies. How many of you, when you move into a new apartment or house, feel kind of weird until you install like a plant or something in the space? Yeah, some of you. That's really strong with me. So that's like this biophilia hypothesis, and I think a lot of us are very, very in tune. We seek out other living organisms, and it's just part of our intrinsic nature. Digressing a little bit more. How many of you take costumes really, really seriously? Rich, yeah, I know you do. Yeah, some, quite a few. So, you may see pirates in the elevator. This is, yeah. And this is Rich and his family. I think that they take it pretty seriously. Rich, you've got it bad. I mean, I think that you are the hobby comorbidity king, I think, of all of us. You're maybe the sickest individual, and I love you for it. I think it's great. And to the point that Rich then mixes costumes and pets and dresses them up for Halloween. And so this is a little bit different than the others, and I promised Kathy that I was going to mention two things, one of which is from her talk, one of which was Reed Mariculture, and the other is Gary Parr and Christine Williams, who used to have Reef Threads podcast. They now have another podcast, like Fiber Talk. So is there anybody out there who does knitting or other sort of needlework as a pastime? Yeah, how about that? I didn't know that was like a point of intersection with our hobby, but it may be. And the reason that I put this up here is that this talk is probably going to be recorded, and there's a chance that either Gary or Christine's going to see it. And I want to tell you that I miss you both, and I wish you'd come back. So finally, I'd like to thank all of you for bearing with me through this sort of like personal meandering dialogue of the history of the aquarium hobby as told by me, and the people who are responsible for the MASNA Award this year. I'm open to any questions that you guys have in the remaining time.